Hello, good evening. Hello, good evening. I'm over here in the corner. So I think we'll try and get started this evening. I'm very pleased to see you all here. Thank you very much for coming. I'm Lyman Howard. I'm the city manager of Sammamish. And it's nice to see so many people interested in the city's finances. Greatly appreciated. And I know we've got quite a bit of financial expertise sitting around the tables. So thank you very much for being here. A special thanks also to our finance staff who've put quite a bit of work into this tonight and are here to share information and start a dialogue about the city's finances. So the way we're trying to do this, we're welcome to sit at the tables, you're welcome to sit in the back, but we would like to have this interactive and get information from folks. We've got, I think, quite a bit of staff here that will be able to assist in answering questions as we go forward. As many of you know, our discussion about our city's finances is something that we do periodically. We have a very strong financial position, and it's one of the things that sets us apart from many of our municipal peers. This has not been achieved by accident, but by design and planning. And we always look several budgets ahead. I have seen and I have heard some comments on Facebook and some of the other social medias that the city's about to fall off of a financial cliff. That is not the case. We have no bonded debt. We have strong reserves. We have ongoing investments in needed infrastructure. And so we are actually in very good financial position, and we want to stay that way. The council has foregone the 1% property increase that they've been eligible to take for the last 8 years. Some have said that the city council should have taken the 1%. However, to do so, the council would have taken the money out of our citizens' pockets ahead of the time of need. Most cities are envious of the position that we find ourselves in. We've had a history of financially prudent and responsible city councils, and we owe them a great deal of gratitude to that. And I'd like to thank the Sammamish City Council members that are in attendance tonight. They do take this very, very seriously. So thank you, council members, for being here as well. Tonight, setting the agenda, we're going to have a discussion on general information. We're then going to turn things over to you all for discussion. And then we'd like to hear from you on how your discussions went and what you have to tell us. And we'll do that through report out by tables. Then we'll do a bit of a wrap up, conclusions, and next steps as we go forward through the next bidder process. So without further ado, I'll turn things over to our finance director, Aaron Anton, to start things out. So Aaron, please take it away. Thank you all.
All right, so starting at the more wide global level, plan formation for the city starts with a 20-year comprehensive plan. So you can see we already start with a long-term planning horizon. So if we go from the comprehensive plan that's outlined, that's the 2015 to the 2035 20-year period. We look at what's currently in play, which is the most recently adopted capital improvement plan. So multiple areas, parks, transportation, stormwater, all have separate capital improvement plans, and those adopted plans, the most recent adopted was 2017 through 2022. So it's a 6-year plan on each one of those. And those are planning documents that are then further narrowed down into a 17-18 budget document, which actually sets the appropriation of all funds and all types in that document. So we've just come through this as a city, had the budget discussions in the fall, and we just adopted the 17-18 biennial budget. And so that's kind of the framework from large to small of how we're getting to the 17-18. When you think about from a state level, does the state put any restrictions on cities. For example, can they spend operating money wherever they want, or capital? What restrictions are out there and what guides those restrictions? So yes, the state does restrict. The city finances, all their accounts and line items have to comply with the BARS manuals. It's a state-issued manual, and that stands for the Budgeting, Accounting, and Reporting System. So there's multiple requirements that lay out the types of accounts and how the city should manage its finances. Generally, those can be broken into different fund categories, such as the general operating funds, which Sammamish has two, the general fund and the street. The capital funds, which are for Sammamish, it's general capital, parks capital, transportation capital. And then the proprietary funds. These are also called the utility funds. So surface water utility, operating and capital fund are considered proprietary funds, and they have to run in their own proprietary manner. So visually depicting that organization, this is what it looks like for the 11 funds. So this is kind of a mix of the accounting requirements and organization that's required, and then how the Sammamish budget is set up. So starting at the top, there are governmental funds and proprietary funds. That's the first initial split. Okay, so governmental funds, you split out that category further into debt servicing funds, if we had any, and then the capital project funds, operating funds, and then over on the proprietary fund side, there's the enterprise and internal service funds. So when the state talks about operating funds and capital funds, those terms, the color codes show that general category. The capital funds are the ones in white there, the 301, 302, 340, and it also refers to the 438, which is a capital fund, although it's part of the proprietary fund structure. When the state refers to operating funds, it's that other mix there of internal service funds. The reason I'm making this distinction is we want to get to what's included in the operating forecast, right, when we talk about general operating forecasts. But first, let's take a look at the capital side. So those were all those white. So you can see here, obviously it has been our pattern in our history of significant capital investments in the past. And also, that's what's planned in the future here in the next 6 years. So you're looking at over 150 million in those past years that have been invested in capital infrastructure in these 4 different areas, as well as what's planned to be invested and continue to be invested in the 6 years ahead. So this is all on the capital side. So that's the white funds. The ones I've highlighted here that are in the blue shading, those are what we call the general operating. So it's a portion of the total operating funds, and it's the general operating because it's the general governmental funds. So these are the general fund for the city and the street fund. So those two funds together form our operating funds, which then is what we use to build the operating forecast. So when we put together the long-range forecast, which was just updated in January at the council retreat recently here, the 2017 through 2024, and we project out using the most recently available data, which is the 2017-2018 budget, along with the adopted capital plans. All those things are coming in, but this is just the operating picture. So on operating revenues, operating expenditures, and then we project outside of the budget period, how long does this structural slope last? So we project that out on an annual basis, and in the year 2020, the year where operating expenses, given those assumptions, exceed operating revenues, is referred to as the crossover point. An important consideration to note here is those highlights. So we do forecast beyond, we do plan for beyond those periods, and this particular snapshot does not include fund balance in this. Okay, so it's just looking at your annual take, but graphing it over a multi-year period. What other restrictions does the state put on the operating side? Not only do they restrict certain types of funds, they also restrict how much. Okay, so a primary example of that is a property tax. So the state puts in place a 1% property tax limitation on the city. That particular revenue source can only go up by that 1% plus new construction, so that's a state-driven cap on that. There's also a secondary cap that's referred to at the statutory 310 cap, which is $3.10 per thousand assessed valuation. That's a second cap that has not come into play in Sammamish history because our levy rate has always been below, significantly below that 310 mark. But that is also a second if that ever was to be. So the state can restrict how much, they can restrict the amount, they can restrict whether it's to be used for capital or operating. So anytime we look at a particular revenue source, we have to go to those state restrictions and make sure there's an allowable use before we can use that for an operating or capital use. So a little quiz for you. What do you think, can you rank from largest to smallest the revenue sources for Sammamish that they have available to fund operations? So we'll give you a few minutes to think about this. So these are some of the general fund sources that cities use for operations, and we're looking at what are the largest ones for Sammamish. So options here to rank: utility tax, sales tax, business tax, fees for services, or property tax. So we'll give you a few minutes to think about that. Want to do a show of hands? We got enough? Amazon? Oh, we're talking about destination-based sales. That would be in sales tax, yeah. Okay, so we've had a little bit of discussion on that. I think the first one's probably pretty easy, or how many folks have the first one figured out? Do you have an idea? What do we got there? Just go ahead and shout it out. Property tax, right? What do you think the second one is? Starts getting a little trickier as we go, right? Sales. I'm hearing sales, okay. What about fees for services? Fees for services, some votes for fees for services? Anybody business tax, utility tax? No, we all know that, huh? Okay, so here we go. A little bit of a trick question, but this are the main revenue sources for most municipalities. So some of you I saw already grabbing your budget and brief document that was at your table. Nice job. On page 4 of that, so I'm noting that page 4 actually breaks down property tax, sales tax, fees for service, and shows in the table there the different sources. So these are shown in biennial budget amounts, so it's a 2-year amount that you're seeing, okay? So those are the answers for property tax, obviously the largest, sales, second largest, fees for services, half of the amount of the sales over a 2-year period. And then, of course, the city does not currently avail itself of business tax, B&O tax, or utility tax. So one. So it depends on how it's structured. So B&O tax versus a licensing or a head tax, so certain municipalities structure this differently. Certainly head taxes, which are an FTE based, can be a greater revenue source than just a pure utility tax that's capped, again, state requirement at the 6%, right, for certain utilities, right? So all of those things can come into play. Thing to note here, I just wanted, because we'll come back to this point later, property taxes, a 1% annual increase in property tax for a 17-18 2-year period is about approximately $550,000. So that's a 2-year number. Okay, so about $275,000 a year for that 1%. Just want you to keep that in mind as a revenue metric there. So how do we compare to the East Side Cities neighbor group? And so this is a slide that looks at revenues per capita metric and all of those different revenue sources that we just were talking about: utility, B&O, sales, property, and fees and other. And you can see the spread here from $1,558 per capita for Redmond all the way down to $730 for Sammamish. And so these are the sources that each of these cities have from the different portions of revenue that they get those from. So another question I get asked is, well, okay, is that just a snapshot of now? You know, is it just like this in 2017? How long has it been like this? Well, I think most people, from Sammamish know that we've never had a utility tax in Sammamish, right? We never had the B&O. So since incorporation in 1999, we've had that profile, and this has been relatively stable with this mix. Yeah, do you have a question here? Oh, sure. Well, if it's a clarification one, we'll go ahead and take that. Yeah. Multiple things. So this would be building permits, activity over time. This is, so all of our charges for services. So there's a whole number of different activities, but it'd be all of our cost of goods types of things that are recovered through a cost recovery method. So that's one of the things that could be looked at, is you could re-look at your fee analysis and see, is it appropriately recovering all your costs? One of the challenges for our costing particularly is our resource level is not high, and it's not as high as some of the others. So there's not as many costly inputs to recover from those fee structures. So we have to be careful to not use that as a profit center. It has to recover just our cost to serve there on the fees. That's also it is just within the city for good. So it's our piece. So although the sales tax rate for the statewide, and this is I think there's a pie chart on this in the budget and brief as well, we're just 0.0085% of that sale. So we get a very small sliver of those sales, but they do have to occur within our jurisdiction. So if somebody is delivering services and goods to us, then it's destination based, right? So it would be applicable and coded here, and so we would get our sliver of that. But we're not getting the lion's share of sales tax, right? So that was revenue side. Do a quick overview on expenditure. Give you a couple minutes to just think about, these are all general services in the general fund, general operating. So different areas: community development, parks and rec, street pavement overlay and maintenance. So this would be your overlays of your roadways and systems, police services, and fire and emergency medical services. So the question is, largest to smallest, where does Sammamish spend its money in these areas? There we go. Are we ready to call the question on this one here? What do we think? What's our largest area of general fund expenditure? Fire. A lot of fires out there. How about second largest? Police. Streets. Okay. So here's the actual order, largest to smallest: fire and emergency medical, police, parks and rec, community development, planning, zoning, permitting, they're all captured in that function, and then roadway pavement overlay program. So we're going to go into this in a little bit more detail on the very next slide. Too fast? Okay. So here is, again, those following along in the budget and brief, this is on page 4. So you have all those numbers. You can take the budget and brief with you, by the way, so it can serve as a resource for you. It's also available on our website for those that are wanting to follow this online. So fire and emergency, medical and police, public safety costs, those are the highest. Public works, street maintenance, traffic engineering, those things all lumped together, that's the third highest. And then we go to parks and rec, community development, and then the overlay program is split out. That's also related to public works activity, but it's dedicated to just the roadway overlay program. So that is a $7 million investment over a 2-year period. Again, all of these costs are a 2-year. Another thing to note on this slide is the first two, public safety costs. I'm just pulling out a metric for you there, the 2% per year, just a kind of an inflationary based type of metric. If those costs were to increase at 2% per year, that would be a $1.2 million increase. Okay, so remember that number because we'll come back to that. Another point here is that obviously the first two are both contracted services for the city, fire and emergency medical through Eastside Fire and Rescue and the King County Sheriff's Office for police services. So how do expenditures compare? So looking at our per capita numbers for expenditures, and again, this is 2015 was the most recent data available here. And by the way, the data is pulled from the state. So this is audited numbers per that BARS manual that we were talking about earlier. So all the states have to comply with BARS. It feeds to the state. State audits those numbers, and once they're audited, they're available in the Local Government Finance Reporting System, LGFRS. And so that's where this data is coming from. So per capita numbers, again, from 1433 in Redmond and to 622 in Sammamish, and this was for the 2015 period. And so I get asked this question as well. Well, this is before the big annexation of Klahani. This was before the budget decisions that just took place in 2017. So what does that picture look like with those? So I just updated the Sammamish number here because I don't have 16 or 17 numbers for the other municipalities yet. They're still being audited as we are for our 2016 results. But this is our 2017 budget numbers that are in there. So based on our 114.75 FTEs and our current population, 61,250, we just went up to the 666, so about $44 per capita increase. So that's to be compared with the 2 years of other increases at these other jurisdictions as well. So the profile is staying the same here. So again, looking at the general operating projection. So we want to look at those expenditure lines and revenue lines going forward and potential options that we want to look at or consider going into the future. Some of the revenue options side, we looked just generally at these. I've included some of the estimates of these different sources. So banked property tax, this is Lyman had mentioned in the opening remarks that City of Sammamish actually has not taken the 1% increase for the past 8 years, and that's built up a levy bank of 1.6 million. So that could be taken any given year. The action on property taxes come before council, but that's the amount in the bank that's could have been acted that hasn't been. So basically is being held in reserve at the moment. Utility taxes, touched on briefly, 6% is the assumed rate, and that's what's bringing up the 6.6 million number. So we've also looked at some evaluations of these different sources on a volatility, diversification, equitable basis, and how we've defined that over time. So that information's there for you to consider as well. B&O tax, not a large number there, 105,000. That is the state limit on the B&O tax side. So there's a question asked about the per head tax. That would be a different methodology if we were to head that direction, but this is just showing the B&O tax piece. So that gives some of the general revenue options side. And then we're opening up now there's 5 specific questions we were thinking as we're going through this information. I'll note the question number 5 then brings together those 2 metrics we talked about, the 550,000, which was that 1% property tax over 2 years, And the 1.2 million example, that was the 2% increase on just public safety costs. Okay, so it's an illustration of that structural issue that's present in that operating forecast. We have revenues that are capped to only go up by that 550,000, and you have expenditures at just an inflationary basis would be 1.2 million. So that's the inflection point that the crossover picture is looking at. So at this point, we would want to break it up into the different groups. We'll come back and talk a little bit about next steps that we're going to go through, but if you want to work through those questions, and we'd like each table to actually elect a speaker for this group, and then we'll come in and do a report out at the end for your ideas and responses to those questions or other things. Thank you.
Okay, I think our time is drawing to a close. Thank you very much for all the work that you've put in. I will make an observation. If you haven't gone through all of the questions, or you disagree with some of the answers to the questions that other people have gotten to, there'll be another opportunity. Aaron will talk about this at next steps, but one of the things that we're planning on doing is having the virtual town hall with very similar questions to these, so you'll have another opportunity. But again, thank you very much for putting this all together. So at this point, I'd like to invite a member from each table to come up to the podium and share with the rest of the group what your thoughts are on the questions that have been posed. So if you could come up in an orderly fashion, that would be great. Thank you. Sure, but we'd need to use the microphone.
Don't get nervous. This is on MSNBC.
I'd like to say I volunteered, but I have 5 members at the table that said no. Okay. We took a different approach. We thought the horse was before the cart with question number 1, additional revenue. Question becomes, are there cost implications we should be looking at first? Then decide what happens with revenue. So last night I did my homework, and if I could have my document here, I looked at a bunch of increases, one year to the other year, and coming from the corporate finance world, as vice president of finance of a corporation in Santa Barbara. Let me move you back here. We always had to justify whatever increases we were, or decreases, but increases in expenditures. So we looked at some of these expenditures, and they go all the way from 14% up to like 49% on categories. Now, there may be justification, but we don't have enough information in these 10 pages to come up with specific concrete recommendations. So what I'm saying is OPEX, the operating expenditures, we have little or we can't decide what has little or no benefit. So why are we increasing 30% in our central services? I don't know. Maybe it's justified, but on the surface it looks weird, right? So what are the perceived benefits? We don't know. There were large increases in headcount. I think it says 114.75. I don't know what it was last year or the year before. Is it down? Probably not. Does it include the contractors? It does not, okay. Because one page here has 99.3 FTEs. Another page has 114.7. I guess there's different ways of looking at different numbers. I know that. But should there be reductions instead of increases? I don't know. We don't have enough information again. And what are the effects of on the cost increases? Primarily headcounts going into 19, 20, 21, like 22. because they tend to be what I call embedded cost. You got an employee who does job X, maybe job Y, and that job is not going to go away. So if we go back to the corporate world, it would be something we'd call zero-based budgeting. You know, what do we actually need? So each department, I would say, needs to identify what their top priorities are in expenditures. Where are they? Public Works, for example. What are their priorities? Not capital, this is OpEx. Where are they? What do they need first? What do they need second? What do they need fourth? So, and before any are approved, we should be doing a zero-based budgeting. That's what our table came up with. It's more on expenditure versus revenue. So.
Very good, thank you. Good comments. This table like to report out? Paul?
Hello there, Paul Stickney, and I got elected to give a report. We echo some of the statements from the first table, and we agree. We took sort of a holistic view of all the questions combined, and the summary of that holistic is, we also agreed that we should know what our needs are first to help answer how much the revenue should go up. And for those of you who know me, know I stutter now and then. I'm not nervous. It just is what it is. There were a couple of comments that talked about how the city has inherited patchwork, sidewalk here, half a road there. And as Council Member Valderrama has talked about, there's a lot of sort of unique pockets all over the city, and that's an interesting challenge. We spent time talking about that. We also chatted about some things that have been stated over several months and years. There's a few things that the citizens really would like to see. More waterfront parks, for example, and I'm sort of answering all the questions at once. More waterfront parks, potentially senior center, arts, so these are some needs. So we chatted a bit about the capital side versus the general side. And it's exciting that the city is doing a transportation master plan that is going to show needs and get more into the weeds of which capital projects are truly needed as opposed to wanted, or some of both. Same thing on the parks. Over the years of coming to city council meetings, some folks feel we need a lot more parks. Some feel we may have an excess of parks. And since the new PRO plan is doing a needs analysis and surveys, we're going to get a lot more specific information in the next year or two to guide what many council members have chatted about, which is how do you get all the capital projects into perspective and which ones are truly the most needed, and to rank a order. Now, that was on the capital side. On the general fund side, many accolades on our table of how well the city's run, East Side Fire and Rescue, you know, EFR, our services here, police, lean and mean staff that do a good job. And lean and mean means they're worked hard and they put a lot out for each person, a lot of positive things. On the revenue side, something I was not aware of is if the city took its entire banked 8%, I thought that was taking 8% once, but that increase goes each and every year thereafter. We were not, some of us here were not aware of that. And on utility tax, which has a large potential upside, if all of it was taken at the full 6%, that $6 million would be each year and after. So our approach as the table was to maybe start with a small amount of each, knowing what the needs are within a year or two in the capital programs. In summary, the capital we have to learn about, but the city in general, everybody felt was pretty well run. So in summary, the concept is to take less of the 8% that is banked, maybe 1 or 2%, and then potentially open the door on utility tax, so those options are there, and then tweak in a nexus point of view. How do things? What's the nexus and proportionality? I'll spit out the P of the needs and the wants on capital, and get citizen feedback with all that information. So our holistic approach, in summary, would be on the capital side. We know there are some needs, but we don't know how much and what is the priority. I'll spit out my P. On the general fund side, cities well run, and we didn't see a whole lot that needed to be changed. And on the income side, start slow with increase on the property tax and utility tax, and then see how it all holistically melds together with feedback and as new information comes in. So that was our report.
Thank you, Paul. Great report out. Thank you. And you're up. Fantastic.
Okay, folks, so our table approached this very systematically, going through the questions one by one. So that's how I will report out. So for the question, should the city diversify its revenue sources? In the end, we said yes, we should, but we also talked about how that's not that's the only option. We need to both look at where we can reduce costs if that's possible, and then also look at where we can increase revenue and balance those two. So are there any services the city should stop offering? We said no. We didn't have anything that we felt was too much. And comparing to the other cities around us, what services would you want to enhance? We identified environmental services as one area. And then we also talked for a little bit about the opioid issue that is in our community, and raising awareness to that, as well as kind of helping educate people about that and what we can do to prevent it in our community. Unmet service expectations that we have now or anticipate having in the future. One of the things that was very common was roads. I think all of us were lamenting the traffic, as well as kind of generationally appropriate activities and services is what we said, but that comes down to things like a senior center, arts, and as well as things geared towards like little children. We talked about like preschool level activities, which are not offered directly through the city at this time. For what should be done when future contracted public safety costs, I can't read that, increase at a greater rate than revenue. We said that should be passed through to citizens, essentially through increasing revenue, and we talked about a utility tax. We didn't talk about the property tax as much, just because the pickup from that isn't as significant as it was with the utility tax, but we agreed absolutely with what you said about don't just do it all at once, kind of incrementally increase it slowly over time to acclimate the community to it. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you, Stacy. Okay. Chris?
Hi, I'm Chris Ross, and our table kept jumping to number 2 because before we look at revenue sources, we want to make sure that we're tight or responsible in our expense profile. And so what we started looking at the services, the quick short answer is we do not want to reduce the service level. We looked at some of the staffing. Is overhead an opportunity for reduced costs with attrition? One of the points brought up by the team is we do not want to lose talent in the city staffing. So we do not want to create any image, or real or perceived, that they're a target for the cost reduction. We do not think they are important. They're not a big driver of the cost. The big drivers we saw earlier on the charts was emergency services are a big driver of contracted services. We also have contractors working for the city, and for cyclical needs, they use a lot of contractors in the city, so they really are responsibly, in my opinion, managing their resources from a staffing perspective. So then you go to the big drivers, emergency services. I think we're benchmarking compared to other cities, we're very low. And I definitely don't think the table thinks that we should take care of our emergency services. That's very important for the safety and well-being of our city. And we need to make sure that we anticipate future growth as we work the revenue and expense equation. The revenue, we want to bring in businesses. We want to have a safe environment, more daytime population when you have more businesses, which will require more taxing on our emergency services. So even if there's a perception that we pay too much for those services, it's going to catch up to us if we do the right things to bring the right people, the right businesses in the city. Which brings me to the number one. What revenue sources do you think are important? One thing the table unanimously struck off the list was the B&O. B&O, for those that are not familiar with that, is a gross receipts tax. That's, even if it's small, it scares businesses. It keeps them out of our town, and if we're trying to bring more revenue sources in the city, it's critical that we do not put something like that on the table, because then how are we going to bring new businesses in if they have small margins? If you take it off the top on gross receipts, eats up their profit, they may lose money. Can't do that. We'll have stores, windows that are for lease. Last thing we want in Sammamish. So go now down to number 3. Compared to neighboring cities, what services do you want to enhance or eliminate? I said earlier, the table didn't want to eliminate anything, but we do have to consider the long-term comprehensive plan and the Growth Management Act requirement for affordable housing, and also mention at the table some low-income housing needs. So that may be a future expectation, something that we've got to be aware of and not overlook that in our budgeting in the long term. And finally, are we going to implement any of these revenue sources early? The table suggested that we continue under existing revenue sources, that we continue to see if that crossover point changes. It may push out. Hopefully it does push out beyond 2020. And if it does, and we continue to perform well as we have in the past, then we will delay and not lock in costs. We don't want to lock in any costs, especially the property tax. And speaking of property tax, we did talk a little bit about the capital budget. We stayed focused on the operating budget, but the capital budgets, one of the concerns is we do not want to use operating funds to pay for capital over the long term, so we maintain and have a greater chance of pushing out that crossover point. And it also forces responsible prioritization of the transportation improvement plan, all those projects we have in our wish list. Make sure we do the right things, the high impact things that are good for the city. So I think that's what the table concluded. So thank you. Oh, sorry. This is an important fact. I missed it, and I should bring it up. Tom.
Always leave them wanting.
And there was also concern about, we need to have suggested that an ombudsman would be working with some of our permitting issues and code issues. So someone could help, a disinterested party perhaps, to help navigate through that when there's issues. The greatest frustration to some of our citizens is not getting answers quick enough. I know the city works very hard to work through those, but they want perhaps a disinterested party would give them some confidence that it is a complex process, but they'll at least focus and help them through the process.
Thank you, Chris. Okay, Fantastic. Thank you very much for all of your comments. Greatly appreciated. Aaron, would you like to run us through next steps, where we're going from here?
All right, so the next step was already mentioned earlier, but just as a reminder, virtual town hall is coming in May, and so we'd be looking at these questions and collecting feedback through that virtual town hall process, probably launching around the middle of May on those issues. So that's coming in May, and then in June 29th, this has already been scheduled. Sure, yes, so this is being recorded, this whole session and the presentation, everything as well. Always the resources for the entire budget document, budget in brief, financial management reports, all of those report documents are available on the city's website under the finance section as well, if you're looking for resources. In June 29th, there's going to be a city council financial retreat, and so that's from 5 to 7 right here in the same place you're in today. So that's what's to come for the next couple of months on this as this conversation continues. So thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. Appreciate having your inputs.